Hi everybody and welcome to our cottage garden. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite gardening strategies, planting a garden for successive blooms. Imagine a garden that bursts with color and life, not just for a few months, but throughout the entire gardening year. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, I'm going to show you how to turn that idea into a reality. So as with every garden, if you're planting a garden for successive blooms, it's also great to have sort of structural plants. So that's your evergreens to give you some color in the winter time, maybe your trees, your shrubs, just some of that backbone of the garden. But here's the first tip. Try to squeeze some of blooms out of all of your plants, including those structural ones. So getting things like, evergreens that bloom are things like gardenia in a lot of zones, mahonias, mountain laurels, rhododendrons and azaleas and camellias are also great examples of that. Just making sure that you're using all of the structure in your garden, all of the plants that you're planting to keep that bloom succession alive. So you could think about things like your spring blooming trees and shrubs, things like, lilacs, ornamental cherries, crab apples. Those are great and they provide such dramatic color in the garden. And then your shrubs, things like buddleias, hydrangeas, hibiscus. Those are going to start blooming midsummer and then go all the way until the frost. Some of them holding their blooms like the hydrangeas, and others, the hibiscus, it's day in, day out, you get a new blooms. And with the buddleia, go through and deadhead and you'll have fresh new blooms throughout the season. And if you're a big fan of roses, you can find rose varieties that are going to start blooming around June for us, and then they won't stop blooming until they're kissed by snow in November. Things like the fairy rose, a lot of landscape roses, the knockout series as well. The next step is to decide on a few staple plants that bloom for a really long time, and then just repeat those through your garden. Use those as sort of your stalwarts. So for me, Vermont Gardening Zone 5A, I love to use hardy geraniums, Nepeta. Those two are probably the longest blooming. Nepeta starts to bloom with our spring bulbs and then continues to bloom all the way through the autumn. Yarrow's another one that can bloom all summer long, all season long. But also echinacea, Russian sage, sedum. There are so many. Just make sure that you're finding the ones for your area. And having successive blooms for as long as you can, it's wonderful for us, for the gardeners. It's great, just to go out and see that vibrant, captivating color. But it's also great for scents, when you're walking through the garden, you have all of these different scents coming from the flowers throughout the year. But best of all, it's so helpful for the pollinators, especially in this sort of shoulder seasons, late winter, early spring, late autumn, early winter. If we can kind of extend our gardening season as long as we can, the pollinators are going to be really, really thankful. The next tip is to visit your local garden centers every single month throughout the year. Now, this is a great way not only to just get a sense of what's looking beautiful throughout the year, what's blooming, but also you can kind of spread out your gardening budget. So if you don't want to plan everything, let's say in the autumn, and you want to plant everything up, or in the spring you want to plant everything up, but instead you want to just sort of spread out your budget, this can be a really helpful way to do that. So to prepare for this, just come in with a list of sort of what you might want, some sizes that you might have in mind. An idea to do this is, throughout the month, go through your garden, see where you have little gaps, where there's either no plants at all, or you're noticing there's no color in this area right now. Then make some notes here. Oh, okay, behind that Nepeta, I've got some room for something that can get maybe 2 to 3 feet wide. And so just kind of check it out. And then when you go, have these things written down and then consult your list as you're looking through. Go to the garden center with an open mind and just sort of say, what's drawing me? What's attracting my attention right now? What flowers am I in love with at this time of year? What scents of the flowers are just incredible to me right now? And then check the stats. Go through and say, oh, okay, is that going to fit into this space? Is that going to fit into this area? That can be just super, super helpful to just keep that succession going. So now that you have a few plants in mind, you're at the garden center, center, what I tend to do is I like to repeat little clusters so that gives this sort of sense of cohesion and flow to the garden. So what I would do is, oh, okay, this one's looking really, really great right now. Let's say I go and there's beautiful daylilies that are looking gorgeous, spectacular at this time of year. I don't have anything in certain borders. And so I think, okay, I'm going to repeat these daylilies throughout the border here, here, and here, just to ensure that that color is repeated for this month throughout the gardening year. You could do it like that, or you could also choose different plants that are looking great this time of year. So you could go in and say, oh, okay, what are the certain plants that are looking particularly good this time of year? All right, I'm gonna do maybe some daylilies here, then I'm gonna do some Russian sage here, then I'm gonna do, just making sure that those same plants that are in bloom are repeated throughout, so that the next year, that month, you'll go through and those will all be in bloom. Next up, plant lots of things that have a second succession of bloom. So the main thing I would focus on for blooms is, those steadfast plants that are gonna bloom for most of your gardening season, so you always have those blooms throughout your borders. But then filling it in with things that you can either shear back, herbaceous perennials that you can shear back, that'll produce that second flush of blooms. Things like veronicas and salvias are great for that. But also roses. Roses are great. You go through and you deadhead and you just keep getting that, more and more blooms. Some roses that I have will bloom, not just the fairy roses, but some of the David Austins will bloom throughout the year. They get a little sparse here and there, but you still have those blooms. So just keep in mind that when you're deadheading or when you are cutting things down like the salvia and veronica, it's going to take them a few weeks to start to bloom again. So you want to just make sure that you have things to fill in those gaps. And not only those gaps in the small areas of the summer, those small little pockets of time, but also some of the bigger gaps. And this is where planting things like bulbs and biennials is really helpful. So especially in late winter and early spring, and this is kind of critical for your pollinators. Having things like snowdrops, things like chinodoxa, things like early crocuses, Timasianus, things like scarlet baby tulips, things like grape hyacinth, daffodils, all of these things, scilla, that the pollinators are just so hungry for at that time of year. But that can be a great way of sort of introducing color earlier in the season, using those bulbs to kind of tide over that gap. And then you have a few other gaps throughout the year. You have sort of a gap after the first flush of blooms. Usually, like for us, it's late June, but it's usually after that first burst, after all of your roses and your lupins and everything have bloomed, and then you have that little gap. So this is great time for biennials, things like foxgloves and hollyhocks. Those can be great because, hollyhocks will bloom for most of the rest of the year, but foxgloves, especially depending on when you plant them, when you sow them, you can really sow things like that for a succession of blooms. Also having forget-me-nots in that early kind of mid to late spring time, that can be a great one to have if you don't have a whole lot of other perennials that are blooming around that time of year. Beautiful wisps of this gorgeous, spectacular blue flower. And then I think probably the easiest, most surefire way of ensuring that you are getting blooms throughout the season is to plant annuals. So you can plant things from seed and then do a succession of seed planting. So maybe plant some in March, then plant some in April, then maybe plant some, sow some seeds into trays in June, so that you can plant out the plugs when they're ready into the garden and then have that succession. And that's a great way of doing it. You can also go to the garden center and buy plugs or buy plants, in little 4-inch pots. It's a fantastic way. It's very, very easy just to do that. And then that'll fill in the border beautifully. Some of my favorites are things like Play in the Blues salvia. I love salvias because of the pollinators and our hummingbirds. They just love them. Morning glories I love to do. You can do all kind of cosmos and zinnias, obviously. And zinnias are also a great hummingbird and pollinator attractor, and butterflies as well. Love those. Snapdragons are also really an earlier one that's really great that you can plant out with your cold season crops. It's a really nice one to extend the season as well. This can be great if you're not entirely sure what you want to do in a certain area. You don't know how to fill this area up. Just to ensure, okay, from when I plant it until the frost, essentially for most of the annuals, you're going to get that bloom. So if you live in a similar area to me, I'm in the Northeast, Zone 5A. And I just kind of want to walk you through sort of season by season throughout the gardening year, some things that you could think about planting. So for late winter, you can look at things like witch hazel, hellebores, Iris reticulata, aconites. If you live in a little bit warmer, you could look at daphnes. That's great for the scent and for the bloom. Winter heath, early crocuses, snowdrops. Then for early spring, you're looking at things like, brunnera, forget-me-nots, bleeding hearts, forsythia, tiarella, trillium, gorgeous woodland plant with 3 beautiful leaves. We have some growing wild on our property that the deer love to eat. It's beautiful, sort of purpley red color. It's a great one. Then in late spring, you could think about planting up, lily of the valley, pulmonaria, lungwort is the common name, a bloodroot, creeping phlox, and baptisia. Then early summer, alchemilla mollis, woodland phlox, shasta daisies, poppies, clematis, and lupins. And then summer, that's when you get your garden phlox starting to peep out, your bee balm, your monarda, your echinacea, dahlias, campanula. Then things that bloom sort of late summer all the way through the autumn. Things like sedum, Russian sage, helenium, Japanese anemone, asters, perennial mums, coreopsis, Joe pieweed, rudbeckia, and autumn phlox. Gosh, you could have a garden that's blooming in phlox every single month, couldn't you? So again, just a few times to kind of be mindful of as you're planning your garden. That winter gap, late winter, early spring gap, just really be paying attention to what's going on. Drive around, see what's going on in other people's gardens, what's blooming in other people's gardens at this time. Even if you can't recognize the exact shrub or maybe even the variety, just make note, that large purple shrub, maybe 5 feet, maybe as tall as me, maybe taller, that has these shape or color of leaves. Go to your garden center and either look for that or ask someone there. And you can also check with your garden center, what is blooming best at this time of year when you're experiencing a gap in that color. Yeah, and just paying attention to winter flowering shrubs, winter flowering plants, anything that's gonna, bulbs, things like that are gonna be comfortable blooming even under a little bit of snow. And then that early summer gap, when things just, they've bloomed, they need a minute to chill, and then they might start to bloom again. At that time, just really be mindful of things that you wanna have in there. You planting things in that kind of, even before that first summer slump where you've got a little bit of time in between when the last of your bulbs has sort of petered out and the first of your perennials start to bloom, that's when you want to fill things in with beautiful perennials like geum, brunnera. Geum is gorgeous, and it's one of those that's fantastic because it looks good year round. Sort of a roughly version of an alchemilla mollis leaf, really beautiful. And I think geums, especially in that late May for us, we have a really peachy kind of apricot colored geum that looks sensational with all the alliums that are up at that time of year. Then the alliums go over, the geums are still there for a bit, and then the rest of the plants kind of take over. But that little gap, that's a great time to plant things like that, like pulmonaria, bleeding hearts, things like that are really going to help you kind of move past the big blooms of the bulbs that you've planted. And then for shrubs, you're looking at, like the lilacs, the peonies, things like that can help you as you move from May into June, that are kind of going to help you along. I think probably in that June gap, having foxgloves, having some peonies. Peonies don't bloom for very long, so they're not one that I would use as a reliable shrub if if you're specifically looking for succession. But they're so ruffly, they're so giant, they're so beautiful. And there's room, once you have this general setup of these foundational plants, and that everything that you're planting in your garden, you have that in mind. You got pollinators in your mind, and you got your flowers in mind. What's going to attract both of those, right? What's going to have both of those going throughout the gardening season? Then you can kind of get away with saying well, I love peonies. I really love peonies. For us, they bloom for a very short amount of time. But, maybe you can say, I'll just put a few peonies in the back. And that way in the back of your borders, maybe not everything's grown up and taken off at that point. We have ours in the back of our borders, and it's perfect because everything's low enough at that time of year where you can see them perfectly. But then when everything else grows up and everything else is flowering and in its full show, they're doing not much of anything. The leaves look pretty, but they're not blooming at all. But they're out of the way. They're in the back of the border, you know. And there's room for every flower in your garden. Let's say you fall in love with a flower and it doesn't really make sense in a succession, in a garden plan for successive blooms. Maybe it blooms very short amount of time and it blooms at a time when everything else is in bloom. That's perfectly fine. You know, again, if you have these structural plants in place, if you have that idea of everything is here to serve a purpose, maybe that little Himalayan poppy or what's something that blooms for just this tiny amount of time? Like columbine. Let's say you're in love with columbine. For us, columbine doesn't bloom for very long at all. I know in some gardens it really continues to bloom and blooms for a long time, but for us, we get maybe a week or two out of our columbine, and that's really kind of squeezing it dry. But I love columbines. So I have a little area where there's lots of other interests there that I like to have my columbines. Just, it's not taking up a lot of space where there could be other blooms, but you know, it's beautiful. And also columbines die back in such a way that if you have a really crowded and packed space, you can barely even see them after they've flowered. All right, so that's it. I really hope that this helps you to get the wheels kind of moving, get the wheels turning about what kind of garden you want to have, how you want to plan out the succession of blooms. In some areas, you can have blooms for the entire year, starting in January, ending in December. You can have them every single month of the year. Unfortunately, not for us unless we're gardening indoors, but for a lot of you, you can. And so I'd love to hear if you're one of those who has mastered the art of successive planting. Let me know if any tips or tricks that you have down below. Make sure to like this video if you like, subscribe if you're not already. It really does help us out so much. And I'll see you again in the next one. Bye.